Hey, today we're starting a new Masechet. Mazal Tov to all those who finished or who didn't yet finish or who are going to finish with us. I know some people came to the Hebrew Siyum last night, and I'm looking forward to finishing with everybody else on Sunday. And I know there were other celebrations going on yesterday as well in different places. So, and for those who have the patience to wait till Sunday, kol hakavod for waiting. I know it's not so simple. And with that, we will start a new Masechet. If you haven't yet listened to Dr. Ayelet Hoffman-Lipson's introduction, I highly recommend it. It's a new thing that we've been doing for the last few Masechtot to have a way of kind of giving the overview, something that I don't really have time to do in a regular class. And Dr. Lipson is excellent at that. Okay, today's stuff is sponsored by Blima Slutsky in loving memory of her father, Yitzchak Tzvi ben Blima and Chaim Shimon. And today's stuff is also sponsored by Gabrielle Altman in loving memory of her friend Naomi Rosen on her second yahrzeit, and for Refuah Shlema for Miriam Eliza Bat Shifra Chana. And I also wanted to especially dedicate today's shiur, since we didn't learn yesterday, Lezecher Nishmat Rasan Ofek Aharon and Itamar El Charar, that were unfortunately killed 2 nights ago in a terrible accident in the army. Okay, we will get started with our Moed Katan. So first of all, Moed Katan, it's an interesting name. Ayala talks about it in her Shiur, about how do we get Moed Katan. The real topic is Chol HaMoed. Laws of Chol HaMoed is kind of like a Moed Katan, because if you think about the word Chol HaMoed, it's an oxymoron. Chol is not sanctified. Moed is sanctified time. So we end up with this kind of in between. By the way, if you realized yesterday, well, if you haven't finished the Masechet, you wouldn't have realized that, but we end with this whole thing about the holidays. And even if you didn't get to the end, the last Mishnah was all about reading certain things on each holiday in its appropriate time. He ended the Mishnah with Vaydaber Hashem Moedei Hashem B'nei Yisrael, and then we lead right into things that you can do on the Moed, on the holidays. So what we're going to talk about, the main topics of this Masechet are Chol HaMoed, and from there we're going to get into laws of Avelut. Because on the one hand, Chol HaMoed we're going to have to deal with. It's on the one hand a holiday, but it's also not a holiday. And the whole question in the beginning of the Masechet is going to be, what is one allowed to do? What is one not allowed to do on Chol HaMoed? And we're going to have all sorts of principles. Now, I want to point out something about the principles that we're going to talk about, which is that the Mishnah, we're going to talk a lot in the Mishnah about cases. And the Mishnah doesn't give principles. And even in the Gemara, you don't always see them all. It's not very obvious. We're going to see, for example, later in the day, in the daf today, we'll get to a part where all of a sudden they start to mention some of these key words that are categories, but they weren't really mentioned before. And a lot of the way they learn is out of example, without necessarily coming and saying, oh, well, this is the general rule. Our job and the job of the Rishonim and the Achronim will come later, and even the later Amoraim, sometimes it's the Stama de Gemara, which is kind of a layer that was after the time of the Amoraim that gets added into the Gemara. Their job is to give it concepts. Here's the idea, and this is, if you want the criteria for what makes something yes, what makes something no, we'll tell it to you. But it's not so clear explicitly from the Gemara and the Mishnah what all these rules are. And if you don't work in fields and all that, then it becomes even a little bit more complicated. So we're going to start with our Mishnah. Mashkin beit hashlachim b'moed. Okay, and then, like I said, I just want to repeat that again. I'm not sure, I think I said it, but very quickly. After that, through laws of Chol HaMoed, we're going to get to laws of Avelut, okay, of mourning and mourning practices. This is the major place in the Gemara where mourning practices are mentioned, what's forbidden, what's allowed, all sorts of things that we're going to see. And that's because when it clashes with a holiday, where the idea of a holiday is to be happy, the idea of Avelut is to create a situation where you're sad. So what happens when they conflict? How can we be both happy and sad at the same time? What exactly happens? We'll get to that later. And from there, they'll get into some other things about excommunication and some other laws as well. Starting with our Mishnah, Mashkin beit hashlachim b'moed ubashvit. You can water, okay, already we have some terms that we don't know what they are. What is a beit hashlachim? We're going to talk about a beit hashlachim, and the Gemara is going to mention a beit haba'al, which is the opposite of a beit hashlachim. A beit hashlachim is a field that needs irrigation. It's a field that can't survive on rainwater alone. Rashi says it's a field that is on a high place, so then the water kind of drips down from it, doesn't stay there, as opposed to, let's say, it's in a valley, but it's any kind of field that needs irrigation. And I'll point out that there's pictures for this Masechet, which will be very useful. I'll send out links to them every day on the WhatsApp group, and they're found on the site. And I'll just remembered I didn't put in the podcast in the Hebrew. I'll have to remember to go back, but I'll try to put the link also in the details of the podcast. Okay, so there's pictures that will help you. I'm not going to always share screen and show you. First of all, it just makes everything heavier and it takes a much longer time to download. And I like to get the Shiur up quickly after, but you can definitely look along and use the pictures that will help you. Mashkim beit hashlachim b'moed u'bashvi'it. So first of all, already we see there this concept of beit hashlachim, which I just defined for you. The next thing is we're not only talking about the moed, which means chol hamoed, and we're also talking about bashvi'it. If already we're going to talk about actions that can or can't be done, we're going to compare it to the Shemitah year as well. If this is going to be permitted on the holiday, then basically we're going to allow it on Shvi'it as well, meaning on the Shemitah year when the land is not allowed to be worked. We're allowed to still water our fields if the field needs watering to survive, and otherwise everything will completely dry out. That's what we call, and I'm going to already give it the term that's going to be used later. It's hefsed. If this is going to be a financial loss, because the financial loss, it doesn't just mean things, right? Let's say you don't go to work. So if you have a store, you won't sell things on Chol HaMoed. Okay, so you won't sell things on Chol HaMoed. That's a loss, but that's not a pseida. Unless you say you're going to lose future clients because your store is closed for this week, people will go, right? Like I'll give you an example. Yesterday, I didn't teach the daf because I'm teaching it on Sunday. And many people listen to other people's dapim. Is that a davar ha'aved? Or now they're going to go listen to other people's shiurim instead of mine because they're going to say, oh, that's better, right? And then I'll have a loss. Like it could be. People will go to the other store. They'll say, oh, the prices are better here. The store is better. I'm going to stop shopping. That would be a loss. But if that's not the issue, then you're not allowed to do it because yes, you're losing some business right now, but it doesn't mean that you're going to lose, in the future. So that's already not going to be allowed. So here we're talking not about a store and things like that, but we're talking about, will your field really get ruined? If your field will get ruined, then yes, you're allowed to water it, not only on Chol Moed, but also on the Shemitah year. And what's the other issue about watering? Well, watering is not a lot of work. It's not like you're digging a ditch in your backyard and you're, doing some sort of more serious work. So therefore, it's allowed. So we have two issues we're going to talk about. One is pseida, or what we're going to call harvacha. Harvacha is that you're just trying to improve it. You want to make it even better. Yes, it gets rainwater, and that's good for the field. This is going to be what we call a beit habal. It's one that doesn't need irrigation. However, if you water it, it'll actually grow a little bit better. That's harvacha. That already is not going to be allowed. And we're going to see in a minute that even within where it's permitted in a field where there'll be a loss, but if it's going to be a big amount of work, we're not going to allow it because we don't want you to work hard. Okay, it's interesting because when it comes to Shabbat and milachot, we know, like, let's say turning on a light, right? I mean, not to get into the whole machlok about turning on lights, but let's assume you hold turning on a light, right? The general psak is that it's a problem. If you think turning on a light is a problem on Shabbat, it's not exactly work. It's not hard work, right? When it comes to Shabbat and Yom Tov, we don't really talk about hard work. Okay, it's not, when we say work is forbidden, it has to come under the category of the melachot, as opposed to when it comes to Chol Moed, where we don't want you to work hard. We want you to enjoy the holiday. On the other hand, we're not forbidding everything. It's this in between, and we have to find that fine line. Okay, now we get another whole new category, which is, this is a stream. Now you have a stream that you channel into your field. Now, if it's been channeled into your field for a long time, that's the second category. It means it didn't just come out now. It's a spring that's been there for a long time, and the channel is very clear. Okay, it's there, and nothing's going to happen to it because it's been there for a very long time. But if you have a spring that just started coming out now, and there's not a very clear channel, the channel that's there could fall apart and could need fixing. This is what we're going to call, I'll say it in Hebrew and then I'll translate it in English, chashash l'tircha yetera. There is a concern that maybe you'll end up having to work harder. So what the Mishnah is saying is, we don't care about that. It's okay if there's a concern that maybe the situation will end up being that you'll have to work hard and fix the channel where the spring is kind of going through to get to your land. That we're not so worried about, okay? We're worried specifically about you working hard, not if we don't want to allow you to do hard labor, but if there's just if right now you're not doing hard labor, but there's a concern that maybe you'll end up having to do hard labor, we're not worried about that. Okay? This is something we're going to deal with a lot today, so make sure you have it clear. Mayan she'yatza b'tchila means a spring that started, that kind of came about recently, and therefore there's more of a concern that it might, the way it's going through might kind of fall apart and be fixing up, as opposed to a mayan shelo yatza b'tchila that's been around for a long time and there's no concern. This is telling you it doesn't matter. Either which way, you can irrigate your field. Soon the Gemara is going to say, well, if it told us you can irrigate your field in the case where there is a concern, why did it have to tell us where there's no concern at all? Of course, that would be allowed then. So we'll get to that. That'll be the first question of the Gemara. Aval, what can't you do? Ein mashkin lo mimei gshamim v'lo mimei akilon. You can't water from a reservoir or from ma'akilon, which is if you have a ditch or a well, and you have to draw it out with a pail, right? Where you have to, it's hard work to get the water out of there. But if the water is just going to kind of be channeled in and it's very easy to do, that's fine. Once you have to work much harder, then we don't allow it. Ve'ein osim ugiyot likfanim. Ugiyot usually means cookies. Here it doesn't mean that. It means like uga. Remember Choni Amagel, ag uga, he made a circle. We dig these little circles in the ground around the vines in order for the water to collect there and then stay there for a while. So you're not allowed to do that. That's also hard work because that's digging. That's already more labor. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah Omer. By the way, I want to point out, the commentaries have a debate here because the first line said you can be mashkim be'er hashachim b'moed u'b'shvi'it, right? Then it says what you can't do, and it's not clear, is this in Shemitah also, or is it just in Chol Moed? And there's a big debate about that. Okay, I'm not going to go into that, but notice what's missing from here is it doesn't tell you which case it's referring to. It's obviously referring to Chol Moed. The question is it also referring to Shemitah? Now we're going to have a debate about another issue relating to Shemitah, specifically right here. So Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says, you can't create this channel, can't build it on the Moed or on Shvit. He says both is a problem. The rabbis say, what are you talking about? It never says in the Torah, you can't build a channel to allow your water to get to your field. It says you can't work the land, you can't plant, you can't plow. But to build a channel, that's just building. That's not working the land. So the rabbis think that's not a problem in the Shemitah year, but Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah thinks it's an issue. We'll get back to all this later in the Gemara. Not today. Okay, if something gets ruined though, okay, you're allowed to fix it up. So now what do we have? We have kilkulei hamayim shebereshut harabim. If you remember, we learned in Eruvin about the Pasei Biraot. There were these places where these public be'erot where people would fill up with water. Imagine there's a pipe coming out of there, and from there people are getting water. If the pipe gets stopped up, so it gets a stone stuck in there, you're allowed to pull the stone out. Okay, that you're allowed to do to fix things. We'll see in a minute why all this is allowed. Chotitinotam means if, let's say, at the bottom of the well, you end up with a lot of big stones, and that's preventing more water from collecting in there for people to drink from. So you're allowed to take those stones out to allow more water to come into the well. You can fix the paths. This happened often. I assume they're talking more here about Pesach, which is after the rainy season. And we talked about this in Masechet Shkalim, I believe it was, where before in Adar, they start fixing the roads and all that for people to come in Aliyah L'Rega. But if, let's say, it rained on Pesach, that sometimes happens, and all of a sudden there's a mess and you have to fix the roads so people can walk on the roads, you're allowed to do that. If the mikvahs get full of, let's say, dirt, other things that get into there and you have to clean them out, all this is allowed. And here we're going to see a general rule, even though I told you the Mishnah doesn't really say general rules. V'osim kol tzarchei harabim. Anything that's for public use is allowed. Again, these are categories. But if it's something for the use of the public, right, whereas before we were talking about your own personal field, that's not public use. These are for public use. We're going to allow you to do things that might even be considered hard work. What else can you do? The Kohanim needed to know where there were graves because they can't walk there. Now, again, you're talking about the holiday where there's a lot of people walking around Jerusalem or going to and from Jerusalem. And the Kohanim need to know where there are graves. And again, if you're talking about, especially after the winter, where everything gets washed away in the rains and the markers on the graves might not be there anymore. So you're allowed to fix that to basically show where the graves are for people. The Yotzin Afal Kilaim. This was another thing that was mentioned in the context of all these other things. We mentioned it recently when we talked about Parshat Shkalim and how they start announcing in the beginning of Adar. They announce about the Shkalim and they announce about the Kilaim. As things start to grow and people might have two different things that start mixing together, so they're supposed to pull it out. Now, what we're talking about here, they warn people already in Adar, get rid of your kilaim, but not everybody listens. And this is an issue. It's an interesting question why they do this. The Beit Din, the courts would send out messengers who would basically uproot the kilaim. They would walk from place to place and see where they saw kilaim and they would uproot them. So if they see things growing on the holiday, they're allowed to pull this out. Again, holiday, I mean only Chol Moed, not on the holiday itself. Okay, now, next, the Gemara starts off, so that's the Mishnah. That's a whole list of things that are permitted, not permitted to do. We're going to focus on the beginning. Okay, Mashkim Beit Hashlachim, B'moedu B'Shvi'it. At the end of Shiur, we'll get back to Shvi'it. Whether it's a new spring that just came up or it's an old spring. So now the Gemara says, right? We said a mayan that's new, and there's a concern that maybe it'll fall apart and you'll have to fix it. Mashkin, yet you're still allowed to. So mayan, why do you even need to mention the other case? There's no point. It's obvious that if there's no concern that this is not a hard labor, and there's no concern that you'll come to hard labor, of course it's going to be allowed. Why do you even need to mention it? So the Gemara says, no, we needed to mention it. Why do we need to mention it? Because now, okay, before we even read this, I want to explain. This Mishnah says, okay, it's what the Mishnah says and what the Mishnah doesn't say. The Mishnah says, it's talking about a Beit HaShlachim, an irrigated field, a field that needs irrigation. The field needs irrigation, then you're allowed to do these things. That implies what? That if the field does not need irrigation and can survive on rainwater, none of this would be allowed. Now you understand why you're going to need to say both. Because it's for the inference you need to say both. Because if you just had the case where it was a concern that maybe you'll come to harder labor, it's permitted in a Beit HaShlachim, but it's not permitted in a different case, right, which we're going to call a Sadeh Beit HaBaal, then you would think if you only said Mayan Sheyatzah B'Tchilah, maybe only that one is forbidden in the Beit HaBaal. But even if you don't really need the rainwater, since it's really minimal effort to water your field, and there's no concern you'll come to hard labor, maybe you'll think that would be permitted. So because of the inference, we need to say both cases so that you know that both cases are forbidden in the other case. That's what we're going to read right now. Itzrich. Itana ma'aya. So itzrich means we needed it to be said. Why? Because itana ma'ayan sheyatzah b'tchila, if you would have just said a spring that just came about, hava amina hachu de Beit HaShlachim in Beit HaBaal lo. It's only in that case that a Beit HaShlachim would be allowed, and a Beit HaBaal, which is a field that doesn't need irrigation, would be forbidden. Mishum da'atelin pule, because it might fall apart and you'll have to fix it. Ava ma'ayan shelo yatzah b'tchila de lo atelin pule. But if there's really no concern, it's not hard labor, and there's no concern you'll come to hard labor, then ema afilu b'Beit HaBaal nami. You might have thought that in a field that specifically doesn't need any rainwater, doesn't need your watering, has enough rainwater to survive on, but you want to water it to make it even better, which you're generally not allowed to do. Maybe you're not allowed to do it only in a case where it might lead to harder labor. But maybe it's okay if it was Mayan Shelo Yatzah B'Tchilah. It's been around for a long time. Kamash Malan, therefore, the Mishnah had to say both so that you know that it's not permitted. Lo Shna Mayan Sheyatzah B'Tchilah, v'lo Shna Mayan Shelo Yatzah B'Tchilah. Doesn't matter what kind of Mayan it is. Beit HaShlachim in, Beit HaBaal lo. Okay, so that's why the Mishnah says both cases. I'm already going to preface this by saying we're now going to go off into etymology. We're going to try to figure out how do we know Beit HaShlachim means what it means and Beit HaBaal means what it means. Okay, and then we're going to go back to this and we're going to point out that back to our topic, not everybody agrees with all these distinctions in these halachas. Okay, there's a wide range of opinions about which kind of field can't be irrigated, in which case, etc. What actions can be or can't be done. Is there a difference between a mayan she'yatza b'tchila and a mayan shelo yatza b'tchila? So we're going to see that this was a subject of debate, and the Mishnah says it so clearly, but the Mishnah is just giving you one opinion, and we're going to see all sorts of other opinions from the same time period that just did make it into the Mishnah. So first, the Gemara is going to say, my mashma, how do we know? Dahai Beit HaShlachim lishana ditzachutahi. How do we know Beit HaShlachim means a thirsty field? Sichuta is thirsty. It's a thirsty field. How do we know that? Dichtiv, va'ata yefe yagea, also connecting to the last Masechet, Amalek, and you're hungry, right? When Amalek attacked us, we were tired, which kind of means tired, thirsty, okay? And yagea, I'm very exhausted. Umitargaminan, and the Targum there is, right, we talked all about the Targum in Masechet Megillah, Za'at mishalhe vilai. Okay, mishalhe is like mishalche. Hey and chet often interchange. And therefore, there you see, mishalhe is ayef, which means a tired field, which means a thirsty field. That's how we see it. How do we know that it's a being in a good state, okay, a calm state, meaning the field is in good shape without our help? This is a verse in Yeshayahu describing what's going to be after the destruction when we come back to the land. It's going to be like a bachor, like a young person takes a betula, a virgin. Ki yiv'al, we'll see what yiv'al means. Usually it means to have relations. Here it doesn't really mean that. Yiv'alucha banecha. Okay, your sons will be the same with you. It's talking about, I think this subject is the city of Jerusalem specifically. Okay, so now what does this mean? What's the Targum there say? Umitargamina, now here's the Lashon Baal that we're looking for, stay Baal. What is it? How do they translate? Umitargamina, ari is ki, when, okay? Kima demitotev olam im betulta. Just like in ulam, a young lad is satisfied, is in a good place with his betula, his virgin that he's going to marry. Likewise, yitiatvun begavech banaich, your children will be settled with you. So that it means settled as regards to the relationship is settled. The Jewish people are settled in Jerusalem, or Jerusalem is settled with the Jewish people. And likewise, the field is a settled field. That's where we get that Baal means settled. And that's the etymology for today. Now back to our Mishnah. Man Tana, who is the author of our Mishnah? We now want to go look at other Tanaitic sources that reflect Tanaitic debates about different things here, about what's allowed, what's not. And we want to know, we're going to point out two main points of our Mishnah and say which Tana holds both number one and number two. So the first thing our Mishnah talks about, and here the Gemara is going to start getting into rules, general rules, like principles that come out of the Mishnah. Mantana de pseida in harvachalo. Who's the one who says that if it's going to be a loss, you're allowed to do it, but if it's just to improve, you're not allowed to do it? Vafilu, and number two, afilu benkom pseida, even if there's a loss, like in the Beit HaShlachim, mitrach nami lo tarchinan, you still can't do something that's a big effort, like making the ugiyot, or using the rainwater to irrigate your field. All those are more work. That's not permitted. So what we have here is, yes, we permit things only if it's a loss and if it's not a tircha yitera. So who's the Tana who says this? So first comes Rav Huna. He's going to give an answer. We're going to reject his answer, and Rav Papa is going to give a different answer. Rav Huna says, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, it's his opinion. Ditnan, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov Omer, moshchin et hamayim ilan le'ilan. If you have water by one tree, you're allowed to make like a ditch to kind of get the water to go to the other tree. Okay, you're allowed to move from tree to tree. Assumption, the trees clearly desperately need the water. But you can't irrigate the rest of the field. You have to do it in such a way that it goes from one tree to the other without getting onto the rest of the field. Because if you do it in a way that it gets onto the rest of the rest of the field doesn't really need your water. It's the trees that need the water. So again, what do you see from here? Hefsed, yes. If it's not a loss, then no, right? If it's just to improve the field, which the field doesn't really need it, it's the trees that need it, then it's not going to be allowed. So that relates to the first point, right? It doesn't relate to the second point, which is what the Gemara is going to say, right? Because we have 2 points. One is you're allowed to do it if it's going to be a loss. But number 2, only if it's not too much work. Now that doesn't appear here. So that's going to be our problem with this. So we did understand that you can't do things to improve, only if it's going to be a financial loss. But he didn't tell you here anything about the second point in our Mishnah, which is if it's too much work, then you're not allowed to do it. So Ela Amar Rav Papa. Rav Papa says, fine, I have a different answer. It's not Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. Hamani Rabbi Yehuda. This is Rabbi Yehuda de Tanya. And here we're going to quote a Braita. The first line of this Braita, Rabbi Meir's opinion, which is a unique opinion, also appears in the Tosefta, with the slew of opinions. Okay, clearly there were all these Tanaitic sources with different opinions about this. Ma'ayana yotze b'tchila, mashkin mimenu. Okay, this is the one that was more of a concern, right? A spring just popped up, and we're worried that it might fall apart, and you'll have to, right? The walls of your where you channeled of your channel are going to fall apart. You're going to have to fix it. Well, he says. Mashkin mimenu afilu ste beit haba'al, divrei Rabbi Meir. He says, even just to improve your field, you're allowed to do this. Because Rabbi Meir's approach is not the one of our Mishnah. Rabbi Meir's approach says, doesn't matter hefsed, doesn't matter harvacha, what's important? And it doesn't matter if there's a concern for tircha yatera. As long as it's not a tircha right now, it's not a big effort, you can do it to water your field, no problem. Do it on Chol Moed. Doesn't matter if maybe you'll end up having to do harder work. And it doesn't matter if it's a field that you just want to improve. All that is fine. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, and that's the one we're looking for, although we're not going to yet understand Rabbi Yehuda fully. And mashkin elaste beit hashlachim shecharva. Charva here means dried out. We don't exactly know what dried out is. We'll get back to that in a minute. So we don't really understand yet how this connects. Rabbi Elazar ben Azalya Omer, third opinion, lo kach v'lo kach. Not like this and not like that. We don't really know what he's referring to because we don't really understand Rabbi Yehuda yet to understand what Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah is saying. So hold off, we'll get there. End of the Braita, Yatev Kain. Furthermore, Amar Rabbi Yehuda, that's what we're going to see. He says 2 things, which is what we need, 2 things. We just have to make sure they match the 2 things we're looking for. Lo yifane adam amat hamayim v'yashkel leginato lechuvato b'chalosh hamoed. Okay, you can't, you can't turn, you can't like undo, one second, let me just get it that really clear that I have this before I say it, maybe possibly wrong. Right, if your channel got full of rocks and dirt and all that, and you need to fix it, you can't go redigging it out, okay? You can't do that on Chol Moed. What does that sound like? Tircha yatera, right? You had a channel, but it needed fixing up. That's already much more of an effort. So at least we have the second part. We don't yet have the first part where we want to say only makom hefsed and not harvach. So now the Gemara is going to say, my harva, what does it mean? It dried up. What dried up? Ilema harva mamash, if we're talking about the sadeh dried up, and then it's saying you can water a field that dried up, well, lama li demashkela. If the field totally dried up, that's the whole reason why it's a loss. Once it's dried, there's nothing you could do. So we're not going to let you water a field on Yantif, on Chol Moed, that entirely dried up, because what's the point, right? In other words, you're not going to help it. It's gone. So Amar Abaye explains shecharva mimayan ze v'yatzala mayan acher. It dried up from one mayan, but another one. Okay, there was one spring that dried up. The dry up is not the field; it's the spring. One spring dried up, the other one is new. And then it's telling us we're allowed to have you, divert the mayan into you. You're allowed to use that mayan to water your field. So now, what do we have? Again, what does he say? Now let's go back to his words. Ein mashkin elaste beit hashlachin shekarva. So now we have a mayan that dries up. We allow you to use it to irrigate what fields? Your Beit HaShlachin only. That's where we have only for hefsed, for a loss, not for harvacha, not to improve. And the last line we read, which we already understood, was, well, you can't do it if it's too much work, even if it's a Beit HaShlachin. So that's exactly what our Mishnah said, and now we're good. In the meantime, we're going to understand Rabbi Lazar ben Azariah. By the way, just to make it a little bit clearer, I made a chart charting out all the different options of all these people so you can kind of organize it in your heads. So you can look at the chart on the sheet. I'm not going to go through it because of time, but you can look at it if you want to review all the approaches. Rabbi Lazar ben Azariah Omer, lo kach velo kach. So what's lo kach velo kach? Not this, not that. Lo shna charav mayana velo shna lo charav mayana. It doesn't matter if it dried up or if it didn't dry up the spring. Mayan she'yatza b'tchila lo. If it's a new ma'ayan, now we get to finally this opinion that goes against what we started with in our Mishnah. Rabbi Lazar ben Azariah distinguishes between no tircha, no work, and no work, but there's no hard work, but there's a concern that you might come to work harder. He says, if it's a new ma'ayan, you can't do it either. Okay, he basically says, not right. If it's a ma'ayan she'yatza b'tchila, then if it's a new one, you're not allowed to do this. Okay, whether it dried up or whether it didn't dry up, it doesn't matter. Okay, the issue is this a new spring? If it's a new spring, relatively new, then we're worried that you might come to fix it. And then he doesn't allow that even in a hefsed. So he's more stringent, right? Rabbi Meir has the most lenient approach. Rabbi Yehuda's in the middle. And Rabbi Lazar ben Azariah says, no, even concern. Right? Rabbi Yehuda says, hard labor is no good, right? Too much work. Comes to Rabbi Lazar ben Azariah, even concern for too much work is not going to work. Umimai. Now they say, wait, let's go back. Right now we assume, let's go back to the beginning. We assume our Mishnah is Rabbi Yehuda, right? Now I didn't point this out when I read it, I should have. But if you notice the subject of the Braita is different than the subject of our Mishnah. Our Mishnah talked about, remember, Bein mimayan she'yatza b'tchila, whether it's a new spring that just came up or recently, or Bein mimayan she'lo yatza b'tchila, or whether it's been around for a long time. It doesn't make a difference. And we want to say that Rabbi Yehuda matches our Mishnah. But what did the Braita talk about? The subject of the Braita, go back to the Braita, it started with Ma'ayan Hayotze B'tchila, one that just came about now. And that Rabbi Yehuda is allowing. So now they're going to say, Dilma, maybe Rabbi Yehuda doesn't match our Mishnah entirely, though, because remember, the Braita and the Mishnah, both are talking about a Beit HaShlachin. When it comes to Beit HaBaal, a field that doesn't need irrigation, they're going to say, whatever we said here is allowed is not allowed there. That point, Rabbi Yehuda and the Braita might not match our Mishnah. Why? Because the Braita was only talking about a spring that just came about now. So if we say that's permitted in a Beit HaShlachin, what are we going to say in a Beit HaBaal? That is not permitted. But maybe when there's not even a concern for Tircha Yatera, we'll never get there. Maybe it is allowed, according to Rabbi Yehuda. So let's read that inside. Dilma akano kama Rabbi Yehuda Beit HaShlachin in Beit HaBaal lo. Only in that particular case of Mayan She'yatza B'tchila, this new one, he's going to say, yes, in a Beit HaShlachin, but no in a Beit HaBaal. Ela Mayan She'yatza B'tchila, but if it's been around for a while, Dilma Ate, I'm sorry, if it's Mayan, sorry, Mayan, Ela Mayan She'yatza B'tchila. Only, he says it about a Mayan She'yatza B'tchila, Dilma Ate Lampule, because maybe it'll fall apart. Aval Mayan Shelo Yatza B'tchila, but if it's been around for a long time, if there's no, number one, it's not hard labor to water the field right now, and there's no concern anything's going to break and you're going to have to fix it and work harder. Maybe he would then say, Rabbi Yehuda in this Braita would say, Afilu Beit HaBaal Nami. Maybe even in a field that doesn't need irrigation, maybe you'd be allowed to do it as well. Because yes, it's true, you don't really need to do it. But on the other hand, this is no work at all. And it's no concern you're going to get to hard work. So maybe Rabbi Yehuda is distinguishing between these cases because he's only talking about one case, which means he might think otherwise in the other case. So the answer to the Gemara answers, and what's the Gemara basically saying? We have no choice but to say it's Rabbi Yehuda because we have no other Tana to attribute our Mishnah to. And we've knocked out all the other possibilities, so we're stuck with this. Now, one answer could be maybe there was another Tanaitic opinion that they didn't know about. It's possible. But the Gemara assumes we must be knowing about all the Tanaitic opinions that existed, right? Why wouldn't they know? Because they're living a few generations later, and maybe it got lost somewhere. Maybe there was some other opinion. But they basically say, since he's the best thing we have, let's assume that that's what he means. In which case, what are you going to have to explain? Well, then why was the subject of the Braita only Ma'ayan She'yatzah Mitchila and not like our Mishnah where both were mentioned? So that's what the Gemara is going to do right now. The fact that it specifically says that one, why? Well, so why? I skipped a line, which just explained it. Sorry, let's go back. Ela Rabbi Yehuda, lo shna ma'ayan she'yatzah b'tchila, v'lo shna ma'ayan she'lo yatzah b'tchila. He doesn't distinguish between the cases, and that would basically fit Rabbi Yehuda perfectly into our Mishnah. Beit HaShlachin in Beit HaBa'alo, right? No matter what, if it's a Beit HaShlachin that needs it and will be a loss, of course you could do either one. And if it's not, you can't do either one. The fact that when Rabbi Yehuda talks in this Braita, he's talking only about Ma'ayan She'yatzah b'tchila. Well, that's because he's mentioned with some other people, one of them being Rabbi Meir, who was very lenient. And it was to teach you, to teach you how lenient Rabbi Meir was. Now, we often say, koch de hetera adif. We like to stress the person who's the most lenient and how lenient he is. So because we only brought that case, it stresses that Rabbi Meir said, afilu ma'ayan yotzei b'tchila mashkim mimenu afilu stei beit haba'al. The Rabbi Meir went so far as to say, even when there's a concern that you might end up working harder and there's no financial loss at all, you're still allowed to do it. And that's his very lenient position. And that's why we specifically took that case to highlight Rabbi Yehuda's heter. Okay, fine. So we've resolved that. Again, whether that's 100% truth, we don't know. It's the way the Gemara assumes that our Mishnah must be Rabbi Yehuda and not some other Tana that we don't know of his existence. Itmar. That was the hard part of today's daf. Now we're moving on to simpler things. We're now going to go to Shabbat and Malacha on Shabbat, and you'll see why it connects, because we're talking about work done in fields, and we want to know, when we talk about watering, what category is forbidden? What malacha does it fall under? Itmar, haminakesh v'amashke mayim lizra'im b'Shabbat. If you weed, what does weeding do? It causes things to grow better, right? And it gets the land ready for growth. And watering the land does that also. So if you do that on Shabbat, mishum mai matrinam be. When I do malacha on Shabbat, if we're going to convict me in a court, I have to be warned. And the warning has to say, Michelle, do you know that if you do this, you are going to get this punishment for this action? When it comes to Shabbat, you have to say, what malacha does it come up under? Which of the 39 forbidden actions is this under? So we have a machloket. Rabba Amar Mishum Choresh. He says it's plowing. And Rav Yosef Amar Mishum Zorea, it's planting. So now we're going to see why. Amar Rab. Kavatei didi mistabra. Mine makes more sense. Why? What does harisha, plowing, do? It heals the land. It makes the land ready, ripe for planting. Hainami, merapuya ara. It's exactly what weeding does. It fixes the land so that the land can grow stuff properly. And so does watering. Amar Rav Yosef, kavatei didi mistabra. What are you talking about? Mine makes more sense. What does Zri'ah do? Planting. It helps the produce to grow. Hachanami, watering and weeding. What does it do? It helps mitzamech pera. It helps whatever's growing to grow properly. So, Amalei Abai leRabba ledidach kashya. Well, Rav Yosef kashya. Abai says to Rabba, what you said is difficult, and what Rav Yosef said is difficult as well. Why? Ledidach kashya, you're difficult because you want to say mishum choresh mishum zorea lo. You want to say, and that's basically what Abai is saying, is it has both elements to it. So you can't say you're only obligated for charisha. What happened to Zri'ah? You're kind of throwing it out, right? You're ignoring it. And the Rav Yosef kasha, mishum zorea mishum choresh lo, he's ignoring the fact that you're actually improving the land as well, not just causing produce to grow. V'chi tema, if you want to say, comes Abai and he says, if you want to suggest, kol hechad ikatarte lo machayev elachada. If you want to say, well, maybe, yes, it's true, there is charisha. And yes, it's true, there is Zri'ah. It's doing both. However, when there's two things in one action, you're only liable one. Well, that's not true. V'ha'amar Rav Kahana. Now, I'm going to leave this question aside because we don't have enough time to discuss this, but you can already start thinking, are these cases really comparable? Okay, they're not really 100% comparable, but Abaye makes this comparison and he says, it's like Rav Kahana said. He brought this following case: Zomer v'tzarich le'etzim. If you prune the vine, and you take why do you prune? So things grow better, right? But you take what you cut and you make a fire out of it. So you've gotten two things out of this, which is like, it's not the same, I agree, but it's like when you water the land, it improves the ground and it helps it to grow. Right? The difference is that that's kind of all one and the same. This is two very different things. One, you're going to make a fire with what you got, and the other is you're going to make the tree grow or the vine grow. But I'm not going to get into that right now. Basically, he says that Rav Kahana said, if you prune and you need the wood, one is because you're planting something, you're helping it grow better, and the other is because you're cutting something. So there you have one action that you're obligated twice. So therefore, he says to Rabba and Rav Yosef, I don't understand, why do you each think you're only chayav one? Kashya. And in fact, we leave this with a difficulty. Now, Rav Yosef is going to raise a question on Rabba. Eitive Rav Yosef le-Rabba. If you don't remember who said what, you'll see it in a second. Haminakesh v'hamechaper lekilayim loke. Rabbi Akiva Omer afa mekayem. Okay, now we're talking about these mixed breeds of two things growing together. When are you liable? Well, if you pull out weeds and you're allowing it to grow better, you're basically allowing the kilayim to grow, this crossbreed. So that's forbidden. And if you cover up the roots with dirt, that also helps it to grow. So you're liable. And Rabbi Akiva, and then you're going to have lashes. Rabbi Akiva says, afa mekayem. Even just letting it stay and not uprooting it, even by not doing anything, you can get lashes. So what does this have to do with Rabbi and Rav Yosef? Bishlama ledidi da'amina mishum zoreah. Hainu da'asira zuri'ah b'kilayim. I say the whole thing of minakesh, weeding, has to do with planting. Now, it says when it comes to kilayim, the only thing it says in the Torah is, sadcha lo tizra. You can't plant kilayim. It doesn't say you can't plow kilayim. So according to me, I say it's planting, then obviously, right, minakesh is a tolada of planting. It's forbidden. But l'didcha da'amar mishum choresh, that it's plowing. Charisha b'kilayim mi'asira. Charisha in kilayim isn't forbidden. There is no such thing. There's no malacha of charisha when it comes to mixed breeds. So amarlei mishum mekayim. Rav Yosef says it's forbidden because you're allowing it to exist. To which he says, that doesn't make any sense. Michlal, Bahami de Katan Seifa. Rabbi Akiva Amar Afa Makayim. Michlal de Tanakama Lav Mishum Makayim. But the Braita set up two different things going on here, right? I think it's actually a Tosefta, that if you uproot it or you cover it, you're going to get lashes. Rabbi Akiva said, even if you just leave it be. So how can you say that minakesh is forbidden just because you let it be? When Rabbi Akiva is the one who says that, not Tanakama. To which the Rabba answers, Kula Rabbi Akiva. Now, really, this whole thing is Rabbi Akiva's opinion. Uma ta'am kama. What it's telling you is, when it says, Rabbi Akiva says, he's actually not disagreeing with the first line. He's explaining the first line. It's all Rabbi Akiva's opinion, the whole source. Why, if you do this, is it lashes? Mishum mekayem. It's not because charisha, because there is no forbidden. It's not forbidden to plow kilayim. What is forbidden by kilayim? Lekayem, to let it stay there. So by you weeding, that's part of letting it exist. So that's why you're obligated. Now, how do we know, right? Rabbi Akiva Omer afa mekayem. My time to Rabbi Akiva, where does he get this from? Detanya, it says in a Braita, sadcha lo tizra kilayim, which makes it sound like what? Eli ala zoreh. Mikayim minayin. How do we know just by letting it exist, you're liable? Talmud Lomar, kilayim sadchalo. What they do is they take the pasuk. This is a classic method of darshaning. We don't do this all the time, but once in a while you see it. It says, behem techalo tarbiyah kilayim. Don't cross two animals, right? Try reproducing two animals, different animals together. And sadchalo tizra kilayim. Now those are two different things, but the way they read it is, we're going to put the comma in the wrong place. We're going to say, kilayim sadcha lo. Don't let kilayim exist in your field. And then also lo tizra. Okay, that's a drasha, and that's where Rabbi Akiva gets it from. Okay, last thing for today. so that was basically this machloket. Is it zorea? Is it choresh? Now that we know it's zorea or choresh, those are the two options. We're now going to get into another question. Tanan mashkim beit hashlachim b'moed u'bashvi'i. You can do it on the holiday, and you can do it right on Chol Moed and on the Shemitah year. Bishlama Moed mishum tirchahu u'b'mkom seder shara Rabbanit. First of all, it's not really clear from the Torah. There's an Isser D'Oraita to work on Chol Moed, or like it's not 100% clear. So we're going to basically say, look, it's forbidden by rabbinic law to do this work. How are we going to define what this work is? So we're going to basically say it's work that, right, we're going to allow if it's a loss. But when it comes to Shemitah, we're going to say, Ela Shvi'i, bein lamad amar mishum zorea, bein lamad amar mishum choresh, zriya v'charisha b'shvi'i mishare. How can you plant and plow on the Shemitah year? How do the rabbis allow this? Yes, I understand financial loss, but it's usher by Torah law to plow and plant. All of a sudden, we're going to say, well, watering is allowed because watering is either plowing or planting. That doesn't help us. That's forbidden. So, right, both of those are totally forbidden by Torah law. So we're going to have two answers to this. The second one we'll deal with more tomorrow. The first one we'll deal with today. Amar Bai, bishvi'i bizman hazeh. Shemitah nowadays is not actually rabbinic, is only rabbinic, according to one opinion. There's machloket. So he says, v'Rebbe, this whole thing, our Mishnah must be only Rebbe's approach. Rebbe says, Detanya Rebbe Omer, v'zeh dvar Shemitah shamot. There's double language of Shemitah in this pasuk. Bishtei Shemitah rakatuv b'tabel. There's two Shemitahs mentioned here, Achad Shemitah Karcha, Achad Shemitah Ksafim. The best way to understand this is to say, Shemitah Karka is when the land returns to its original owner in the Yovel year. And the other is Shemitah Ksafim, which is every Shemitah year, you're not allowed to work the land, even though there's other ways to understand this, but we'll go with this interpretation. The Jubilee year is no longer relevant because most of the Jews aren't in the land anymore. Whole question about what about nowadays, but we'll leave that question aside. But in their time, right, basically in the time of the Amoraim, most of the Jews weren't in Israel anymore. There's no Jubilee year. Since there's no Jubilee year, there's no Shemitah year either from Torah law. Only rabbinic law. Once it's rabbinic, okay, so we can permit it if there's a hefsed. Rava amal afilu tema Rabbanan avot asarach mana toladot asar lo asarach mana. Yes, it's true. Charisha and Zriya are forbidden by Torah law, but the toladot, but something that comes from it, is not forbidden by Torah law, and therefore, when it comes to watering, it's only an outgrowth of Zriya or Charisha, and that's why you're not liable. We're going to have to deal with this a lot more in tomorrow's daf, which will go up in the next half hour, 40 minutes or so. So have a Shabbat Shalom, everyone. There's our first day of Moed Katan, not a simple daf, but you'll get the hang as we go on. Shabbat Shalom.